My mind was reeling as I suddenly regained consciousness, completely surrounded by a noisy, chaotic mob. By some bizarre twist of fate, my modern soul had crossed over into the body of a man sharing my exact name, Shir, residing in the ancient Great Chu Empire within the rustic village of Shiruin. All around me, an aggressive auction was taking place as people shouted bids for captive laborers. 2 agonizing years of drought had driven the local authorities to sell these unfortunate souls to the highest bidder. A heavy air of absolute despair hung over the entire gathering. Wealthy merchants tossed silver coins, aggressively competing over a muscular woman hoisting a massive grinding stone. Suddenly, an arrogant man sporting a hideous facial mole approached and began to taunt me. His name was Lujigal, a former lackey for my household during our prosperous days, who had grown bold and abusive following my father's passing. He was visibly taken aback when I delivered a sharp, icy retort to his insults. The original owner of this body would never have dared to speak up like that. Glancing at my own tattered state, I realized my utter poverty. I possessed 0 currency and only a single pound of grain slung over my shoulder. It was absurd that the previous Shir harbored fantasies of marriage while living on the brink of starvation, a foolishness that made me shake my head in disbelief. I was preparing to walk away from the chaos when a completely ignored female captive caught my eye. Though gaunt and covered in the grime of a grueling trek, her underlying, stunning elegance was undeniable. Bound by iron chains, she maintained a dignified, silent posture, showing off porcelain skin, striking brows, and an icy, unbothered gaze. She looked exactly like a diamond hidden in the rough. I casually asked Lujigal if my meager sack of rice would be enough to purchase her. He burst into hysterical laughter, prompting bystanders to join in and advise me to eat my rations rather than throw them away on a woman. Yet, Lujigal quickly shooed the onlookers aside, eager to deceive me into squandering my only means of survival. Feigning camaraderie, he urged me to secure the purchase quickly, entirely convinced I was still the gullible pushover he used to manipulate. Internally, my pulse skyrocketed at the prospect of trading a mere handful of grain for someone so breathtaking. Taking a decisive step toward the official, I presented my pitiful bag of rice as payment. A sudden hush fell over the marketplace as the spectators gaped at me in sheer disbelief. The bound woman finally locked her pristine, frosty eyes onto mine, a flicker of bewilderment breaking her calm facade. Up until now, the crowd had shunned her as if she carried a plague, avoiding her gaze entirely. Meeting her flawless, piercing stare made my chest thump wildly against my ribs. I knew I had to mask my enthusiasm, terrified that a wealthier buyer might notice her worth and outbid me. Staring down at my ragged garments and woven shoes, the official scowled in judgment. He cautioned me that she had suffered from a severe cough throughout the entire expedition and was widely believed to be infected with a disease. He sternly advised against dragging such a burden into my already miserable life. Before I could utter a single word in response, Lujigal abruptly intervened. Putting on a dramatic show, he dropped to his knees, calling me his dear brother while pleading with the guard to accept the deal. I was genuinely taken aback and ironically thankful for this idiot's interference. Even knowing his true motive was sheer malice, he was unwittingly playing right into my hands. To sell the act, I aggressively rubbed my face, forcing a few pathetic tears to fall from my eyes. I pleaded with the guard, explaining that with all my senior relatives dead and Lujigal being completely infertile, the survival of my family's lineage rested solely on my shoulders. I practically begged for his compassion, emphasizing that without a bride, my ancestral name would be erased from history forever. Overhearing this humiliating speech, the bound captive shook with silent rage, clearly convinced I viewed her merely as a vessel for breeding. However, a quick glance at the heavily armed soldiers stationed by the exit convinced her to bite her tongue, fully aware that falling into their hands was a guaranteed death sentence. Lujigal was totally oblivious to my sly insult at first, loudly echoing my pleas from his knees before the realization that I had just publicly announced his impotence finally hit him. He shot me an absolutely murderous glare, desperately trying to determine whether I was intentionally mocking him or just genuinely that brainless. Clearly exhausted by our pathetic theatrical display, the official snatched my sack of grain, shoved the woman's restraints into my hands, and ordered me to get out of his sight. I rapidly stammered my gratitude and seized her hand, eager to escape before the guard could reconsider the transaction. A violent shudder ran through her entire frame at the touch of my callous skin, yet she swallowed her disgust out of pure necessity. Her only options were to follow a destitute stranger or face the military escort, which was essentially a one-way ticket to the grave. As we hurried away, the marketplace erupted in hushed murmurs, branding me a colossal idiot for inviting a plague-ridden curse into my home. One bystander even identified me as the naive former heir from Stone Ox Village, the poor sap whose entire inheritance was swindled away by his own vicious uncle. Luji Gal watched us depart with a wicked sneer plastered across his face, absolutely reveling in my perceived misfortune and future misery. Tuning out their endless mockery, I focused on completing a few necessary supply runs for the village before leaving the settlement. During the trek back, my new companion practically sprinted down the dirt path, desperate to put as much distance as possible between herself and those authorities. Despite my attempts to strike up a conversation, she maintained a wall of absolute silence, though I couldn't help but continuously steal glances at her. With her impressive height, graceful movements, and endless legs, my modern sensibilities told me she could easily grace the cover of a high-end fashion magazine. A smug grin spread across my face as I realized those clueless villagers had blindly let a priceless gem slip right through their greedy fingers. However, the moment we finally arrived at my property in the village, the urge to break down and weep absolutely overwhelmed me. My estate was nothing more than a lopsided, dilapidated wooden shack with two pathetic animal pelts serving as a makeshift door, looking as though a stiff breeze would flatten it completely. I frantically scoured the miserable interior for tools, but the only item of any conceivable value was a dull, primitive knife carved from bamboo. Scanning the desolate surroundings, the woman finally broke her silence with a quiet, painfully blunt observation regarding my extreme poverty. Suppressing a cough of embarrassment at her obvious remark, I firmly assured her that she had nothing to worry about and I would never allow her to starve on my watch. Instructing her to scrub the journey's grime from her face, I announced my plan to forage for edible roots and wild greens in the mountain behind our shack. I issued a strict warning against wandering off, explaining that the adjacent settlements housed my bitter rivals, and the surrounding woods were crawling with deadly wild boars and hungry tigers. When she skeptically questioned if I feared she might flee the moment I left, I simply replied that remaining inside the cabin was strictly for her own survival. Gripping my meager bamboo blade tightly, I turned my back on the shack and marched straight into the treacherous, forested foothills. My sole driving priority in this new world was to hunt down absolutely anything edible to soothe the gnawing, painful ache of our empty bellies. Back in my modern existence, I had never experienced the true, gnawing agony of a genuinely empty stomach, having squandered my days safely scrolling through the internet in absolute comfort. Yet, as I navigated these harsh wilderness trails, the very real, terrifying threat of death by starvation seeped deep into my marrow. I pushed further into the dense foliage in search of sustenance, leaving the woman securely inside the shack. Remaining indoors was far preferable to risking a gruesome encounter with the savage predators prowling the timberland. Completely unbeknownst to me, my new companion utilized my absence to scrub the filth from her face in the nearby creek. With the layers of grime finally washed away, her breathtaking, authentic allure was entirely exposed to the daylight. Radiant skin, delicate features, and luminous eyes proved that my initial assessment of her appearance had woefully underestimated her charm. Unearthing a primitive stone hoe from the shed, she proactively began tending to the pitiful patch of earth that served as my vegetable garden. While the vast majority of agricultural workers in the Great Chu era had transitioned to using bronze implements, my reliance on a rock lash to a stick perfectly highlighted my absolute destitution. Meanwhile, Luji Gal had returned from the market and stealthily crept onto my property to eavesdrop on my household. Catching a glimpse of her newly pristine face left him utterly paralyzed with shock before a fiery wave of furious envy washed over him. He was entirely incapable of accepting that the village idiot he so frequently tormented had legally acquired such a stunning prize for the cost of mere table scraps. Attempting to slink closer to her, he was abruptly halted when she raised the heavy stone tool and icily reminded him of her supposed contagion. The threat of a deadly plague swiftly extinguished his advances, as catching an illness in this brutal era guaranteed a painful demise, though his lecherous eyes remained glued to her form. He eventually retreated, swearing to return later while already plotting a malicious scheme to degrade her right before my eyes. Far above the village, my own search for provisions was proving incredibly grueling. The relentless, 24-month drought had effectively transformed the vibrant mountain into a barren wasteland. Starving locals had already wiped out the entire accessible wildlife population, right down to the rodents, while the remaining hares were far too cunning to trap. The local flora offered zero relief, with stripped fruit branches and heavily overforaged patches of edible weeds. However, I managed to stumble upon a hidden cache of wild mushrooms. The indigenous population actively avoided these fungi due to their inability to distinguish the edible varieties from the lethal ones, a life-saving skill I fortunately possessed. I also uprooted a substantial quantity of kudzu tubers, a nutritious plant completely ignored by the local culinary customs. Sifting through the memories of this body's previous occupant, I recalled he had painstakingly hoarded a single jar of cooking fat intended for his eventual marital banquet. The sheer pathos of his meager existence genuinely elicited a twinge of pity from me. Delving deeper into his inherited knowledge, I pieced together crucial details regarding the technological limitations of this reality. While culturally mirroring ancient Chinese civilization with its literary traditions and civil service examinations, their metallurgical progress had completely stalled at bronze, leaving iron entirely undiscovered. Furthermore, the concept of a repeating, mechanical bow was completely alien to their warfare and hunting strategies. This realization sparked a brilliant idea in my mind. Given my extensive previous career manufacturing intricate, traditional handicrafts, my mechanical aptitude was exceptionally high. If I could successfully engineer a functional crossbow, I could easily dominate the local food chain and guarantee a steady meat supply. Gathering my harvest of tubers and fungi, alongside carefully selected timber for my weapon project, I began the descent back to my hovel. Upon reaching my plot, I was greeted by the revolting sight of Luji Gal aggressively pounding on my door, clad only in his undergarments. He was belligerently demanding the woman grant him entry, loudly proclaiming my inability to provide for her and insisting she abandon me for him. I had never anticipated his audacity to trespass so brazenly while I was out foraging. Catching him half-naked and harassing my companion on my own doorstep would have terrified most men. Yet he showed absolutely zero fear or remorse when our eyes finally met. The arrogant man scowled at my arrival and dismissively ordered me to return to my foraging in the woods. He brazenly declared that the beautiful captive belonged to him now, daring me to raise any objections to his claim. His years of relentlessly tormenting the previous owner of my body had given him the false confidence that he could speak to me however he pleased. Rather than wasting my breath on a response, I remained completely silent while visually scanning the immediate area for a makeshift weapon. My silent defiance only fueled his rage, prompting him to erupt into a fit of aggressive screaming. He loudly proclaimed that my connection to the woman was invalid, arguing that his dramatic begging had been the true reason the official handed her over. Spewing vicious insults, he branded me a worthless failure who was entirely undeserving of ever taking a bride. Seizing my opportunity, I snatched up the heavy stone hoe and launched a vicious swing directly at his body. The attack caught him completely off guard, leaving him no time to react or defend himself. He crashed violently into the dirt, his eyes bulging in absolute, terrified disbelief at my sudden retaliation. Roaring in fury, I reminded him that my own hard-earned rations had purchased her and that he was nothing more than a lowly former servant of my household. I demanded to know how someone of his pathetic stature could ever possess the audacity to lay a finger on my property. Without hesitating, I brought the heavy agricultural tool crashing down for a second strike. Although he scrambled desperately out of the way, his arm hung at a grotesque, unnatural angle, clearly fractured from the initial impact. Clutched in pain, he pointed an accusing finger at me, screaming threats that the local villagers would unite to exile me for this assault. Abandoning the hoe entirely, I refused to engage in a shouting match, instead leaping directly onto his chest and driving my fist into his face. The brutal punch instantly shattered his nose, sending it violently to the side as a heavy flow of blood erupted from his nostrils. I unleashed a relentless barrage of heavy slaps, battering his face until it puffed up into a grotesque, swollen mess. My thirst for vengeance still unquenched, I snatched up a heavy rock, pinned his hand flat against the hard dirt, and brought the stone down with crushing force. An ear-piercing shriek of absolute agony ripped from his throat, echoing loudly across the rural landscape. He gazed down at his mangled, deformed fingers in sheer horror just before the delayed wave of excruciating pain fully registered in his brain. Scrambling out from under my grip, he sprinted away in a blind panic, loudly sobbing and screaming profanities as he fled. I pursued him relentlessly down the path until his pathetic, retreating figure completely vanished from my sight. Back inside the dilapidated cabin, my new captive had been silently observing the entire bloody spectacle through a crack in the window. Her body language made it incredibly obvious that she was now terrified of me, clearly fearing that I might unleash the same brutal violence upon her. I gently rapped on the wooden frame and calmly asked if that despicable Luji gal had managed to lay his hands on her. After she quietly confirmed he hadn't touched her, I inquired if she required anything at all, to which she again gave a short, negative response. I informed her that I was about to prepare a meal and invited her to join me, but she stubbornly insisted she possessed no appetite. Deciding against forcing the issue, I simply accepted her refusal and went about my business. Heading out to the nearby creek, I thoroughly rinsed the dirt from the wild fungi I had successfully foraged earlier. Retrieving the precious jar of cooking fat the previous owner had hoarded, I fired up the primitive earthen stove and began frying my harvest. Spying on me through a narrow gap in the doorway, her facial expression revealed deep confusion regarding my culinary choices. In this undeveloped era, the local populace strictly avoided all mushrooms under the mistaken belief that every single variety contained lethal toxins. Her fears were rooted in memories of seeing royal servants perish from consuming the wrong fungi, but my modern knowledge allowed me to confidently identify the harmless types. Before long, the incredibly savory, mouth-watering aroma of sizzling mushrooms wafted through the entire campsite. The delicious scent betrayed her earlier claim of not being hungry, as the loud, rumbling protests of her starving stomach easily reached my ears. I called out a second invitation for her to dine, fully aware that the intoxicating fragrance was rapidly eroding her willpower to refuse. Overcome with concern despite her hunger, she finally broke her silence to urgently warn me against ingesting the supposedly deadly meal. She insisted that she had been taught from a young age that all such fungi were lethal, but my modern expertise told me otherwise. To prove my point, I ladled the steaming mushroom broth into a chipped earthenware bowl and took a deliberate, savory sip. The taste was incredibly rich and earthy, reminiscent of the premium, expensive wild delicacies from my previous life. I calmly explained to her that only specific varieties carried toxins, but she remained completely skeptical, privately deciding she would rather chew on tree bark later to survive. Leaving a modest portion of the hot food aside for her, I shifted my entire focus to the critical task at hand, assembling the crossbow. Given the brutal beating I had just delivered to Luji Gal, there was no doubt he would return seeking bloody retribution. I desperately required a reliable weapon, not just to defend my home, but to hunt game and generate an income. As darkness draped over the landscape, a gentle mountain wind began to whistle through the high canopy. My fingers flew through the assembly process, my years of industrial manufacturing experience proving to be an invaluable asset in this primitive era. Bit by bit, a functional repeating crossbow began to manifest from the raw lumber under my hands. Inside the dark shack, the the severe lack of nourishment finally caught up to the woman, causing her to collapse into unconsciousness. Awakening in the dead of night, she was utterly astounded to realize that I had not taken advantage of her helpless state. Throughout her grueling journey into exile, she had witnessed countless captive women suffer horrific abuse at the hands of men, making my restraint almost unbelievable to her. A sudden wave of panic washed over her as she realized I might have succumbed to the supposedly toxic mushrooms while she slept. She scrambled to the entrance and anxiously peered through a narrow opening to inspect the campsite. To her absolute bewilderment, she found me perfectly healthy, bursting with vitality, and diligently carving away at the timber. A triumphant laugh escaped my lips the moment the final component of the crossbow snapped into place. It was a basic prototype, utilizing entirely wooden mechanisms and braided cord rather than a forged iron trigger, but it was fully functional. Whittling a handful of sharp wooden bolts, I loaded the magazine, aimed at a distant trunk, and pulled the release. The projectiles sliced through the night air, embedding themselves into the wood with a series of heavy, satisfying impacts. Watching silently from the threshold, the woman was left completely awestruck by the demonstration. Coming from a prestigious military lineage, she possessed extensive knowledge of traditional weaponry, yet she had never witnessed a mechanism capable of firing multiple projectiles with such ease. Examining the target tree, I estimated the weapon's effective lethality to be roughly 60 meters. While it paled in comparison to the high-spec replicas I engineered in my past life, it was more than adequate for wilderness hunting and personal protection. I resolved that once I secured some currency, I would purchase animal hide and horn to reinforce the limbs, alongside bronze for proper triggers and piercing tips. An even grander revelation suddenly struck me. This primitive society was entirely limited to bronze, with iron and steel completely undiscovered. If I could successfully construct a furnace to smelt iron or and refine high-carbon steel, I could produce an arsenal that would be absolutely unstoppable in this era. The sheer potential of the idea made my blood pump, realizing my years as a dedicated craftsman had prepared me perfectly for this destiny. My train of thought was interrupted as the woman quietly approached from behind, softly inquiring about the nature of the strange device. Turning around to face her, I was caught completely off guard by how revealing her light garments appeared under the glowing moonlight. Realizing my eyes were lingering on her silhouette, I quickly averted my gaze to maintain my composure. She scowled slightly at my reaction and defensively crossed her arms over her chest. I cleared my throat and explained that the weapon was a repeating crossbow, a term that meant absolutely nothing to her unfamiliar ears. I informed her that I was heading out into the dark slopes immediately to hunt for wild game. Gesturing toward the bowl of food I had set aside, I urged her to eat and strictly instructed her to barricade herself in the hidden root cellar beneath the straw flooring if Luji Gal returned with reinforcements. Just before departing, I inquired about her identity, but she merely delivered an icy response, stating that knowing her name would serve me no purpose. I offered a faint grin, silently reasoning that since she had nowhere to flee, I possessed all the time in the world to break down her defenses. With my freshly crafted mechanical bow and a quiver of wooden bolts in hand, I marched back up into the dark peaks. The moment I disappeared into the foliage, she approached the target tree to inspect my handiwork. Discovering 2 wooden projectiles driven deep into the solid trunk left her completely paralyzed with astonishment. She found it nearly impossible to comprehend how simple timber bolts could achieve such terrifying piercing power against a living tree. As the night wore on, my companion fell deep into thought, consumed by the realization that if her father's personal security detail had possessed such advanced weaponry, he might still be alive. Her intense fascination with the unique weapon ultimately convinced her to abandon her initial designs of escaping under the cover of darkness. Ultimately, her severe starvation overrode her caution, rendering her entirely incapable of resisting the savory fragrance of the leftover mushroom broth. Sampling a microscopic morsel first, the explosive, rich flavor utterly captivated her palate, causing her to lose all restraint. She devoured the entire portion, going so far as to lick the cooking vessel completely clean. After thoroughly rinsing the utensils, She retreated indoors and secured herself within the subterranean root cellar exactly as I had instructed. Meanwhile, my trek into the wilderness immediately hit a major snag. Wang Hai, celebrated as the premier tracker in our community, was blocking the primary trail with a posse of local youths, loudly boasting of his archery talents. The instant his eyes landed on me, he launched into a stream of ridicule, branding me the ultimate disgrace of the settlement. He loudly jeered that while my late father had been a legendary woodsman, I had grown up to be an utterly incompetent parasite. I attempted to tune out his insults and navigate past the group, but a sharply aimed arrow suddenly thudded into the earth right beside my sandal. Pivoting slowly, I locked an icy, murderous stare directly onto him without uttering a single syllable. The sudden, dark intensity radiating from my expression instantly struck the entire group dumb, suffocating their laughter. They could instinctively sense that the spineless, submissive coward who used to grovel for mercy was entirely gone. A suffocating, heavy tension gripped the clearing. Once their aggressive posturing finally ceased out of sheer unease, I quietly melted into the dense undergrowth. A wave of forced, nervous laughter erupted behind me as they desperately joked about the village fool pretending to be a dangerous man. They began cracking crude jokes about the ailing female captive I had brought to my cabin, entirely oblivious to the reality of the situation. I was actually crouching mere feet away in the shadows, my loaded repeating mechanism aimed directly at their exposed throats. Had I not prioritized keeping a low profile over petty vengeance, those arrogant fools would have ended up as corpses before sunrise. Suppressing my boiling rage, I chose an alternate path and slipped further into the wilderness. Before long, I spotted a wild hare peacefully grazing in a patch of moonlight. Raising the stock, I unleashed a rapid succession of bolts, dropping the target instantly without giving it a chance to startle. The mechanical bow performed beyond my wildest expectations. Throughout the remainder of the night, my aim proved nearly flawless, securing kill after kill. I even managed to ambush a massive wild boar, though its incredibly thick, mud-caked hide absorbed the initial impact, allowing it to crash through the brush and escape before I could deliver a lethal follow-up shot. By the time the first rays of dawn broke through the canopy, I was hauling a massive bounty of over 20 hares on my back. In the local economy, a single pelt commanded a price of 1 copper coin, meaning a mere 5 pelts could secure me a full pound of grain. Combined with the roughly 10 pounds of fresh, consumable meat, our immediate starvation crisis was officially averted. Despite my massive success, I maintained strict operational caution. Before making the final descent to my property, I carefully concealed the prototype weapon in a secure, hidden cache deep within the mountain wilderness. An armament of this catastrophic power was completely unheard of in this era, and its premature discovery would paint a massive target on my back. I understood that this game-changing secret had to remain entirely buried until I amassed enough personal influence and martial strength to protect myself. Just as I was clearing the tree line, the distant sound of Wang Hai and his crew echoing through the valley caught my attention as they loudly celebrated another profitable night of tracking. The absolute arrogance on their faces instantly evaporated the moment I crossed their path, hauling a massive cluster of over 20 hares bound tightly with coarse twine. Their jaws literally dropped in sheer disbelief, having strained through the entire freezing night only to secure 3 pathetic, undersized targets. In stark contrast, my clothes were drenched in dark crimson fluids, making me resemble a lethal predator straight out of a horror story. Blinking back his shock, Wang Hai aggressively demanded to know if I had somehow secured this entire massive haul completely single-handedly. Rather than offering an explanation, I slowly turned my head and fixed him with the exact same freezing, murderous glare from the night before. A suffocating silence instantly gripped the entire pack, with not a single individual daring to utter a syllable under my gaze. I coldly confirmed my success, deliberately challenging them by asking if they possessed the courage to try and strip the meat from my hands. One of his flunkies rapidly stammered a denial, utterly terrified of a confrontation. I warned the entire group to permanently stay out of my way before turning my back on them and continuing down the dirt road. The moment I was out of arm's reach, They desperately began fabricating excuses to protect their fragile pride, loudly whispering that I must have raided someone else's private snares. They desperately clung to the excuse that a useless loser who couldn't hit a stationary target to save his life had suddenly outclassed their absolute best tracker. Further down the mountain track, the local women foraging for edible roots froze in absolute astonishment as I marched past. Several of these bitter gossips had spent years tormenting the previous owner of my body and initially eyed my bounty with greedy intentions. However, one razor-sharp, warning look from me completely paralyzed their tongues, sending a clear message that the vulnerable boy they used to abuse was gone. Arriving at my property, I discovered that the woman had already risen and was actively organizing the interior of the dilapidated cabin. Spotting the heavy stains covering my garments, her immediate instinct was to anxiously inquire if the blood belonged to me. Her genuine concern brought a genuine smirk to my face, prompting me to playfully tease her about already acting like a devoted, caring spouse. She visibly bristled at my brazen attitude, finding such familiar banter far too forward for her highly disciplined sensibilities. Diverting the tension, I inquired if she possessed the necessary skills to properly skin and dress the pelts. Upon her quiet affirmation, I instructed her to handle the processing while I retreated indoors to catch up on much-needed sleep. I added that she shouldn't overexert her fragile body, promising to prepare a hot meal for us the moment I woke up. This casual remark left her completely stunned, as the rigid patriarchal laws of the Great Chu dynasty dictated that culinary duties fell entirely on women. In this era, any wife who failed to serve her husband would be severely beaten and publicly disgraced. But coming from a modern society, I held absolute contempt for such archaic traditions. As she gathered the heavy bundle of game and navigated down to the creek for processing, I stepped across the threshold of my shack. The interior had been completely transformed, with the loose bedding neatly stacked and swept, replacing the chaotic mess that used to resemble a wild animal's den. The mere presence of her organizing touch was already making this miserable hovel feel like a genuine home. Collapsing onto the makeshift bed, the intense exhaustion of the night finally claimed me, sending me into a profound, dreamless slumber. My isolated plot sat on a distinct elevated ridge, positioned roughly a few hundred meters overlooking the main village settlement. Years ago, my late father had served as the revered leader of this entire community, celebrated as a legendary martial figure across the entire Green Bull Mountain region. Tragically, he was foully betrayed and murdered by his own flesh and blood, my treacherous second uncle. Following the assassination, that greedy relative seized the entire family estate, forcefully banishing the rightful heir to rot alone in this crumbling wooden shack. While a large portion of the local populace shared my bloodline, the most parasitic among them was undoubtedly my fourth aunt, Su Fengying. She had spent years manipulating the naive former owner of this body, routinely swindling him out of whatever meager resources or small game he managed to forage. The second the rumor reached her ears that I had marched into town with over 20 hares, her greed ignited, sending her sprinting up the ridge while mentally calculating the massive profits she intended to steal. She estimated the haul to be worth over 30 copper coins in raw pelts and fresh meat alone. Arriving at the property exactly at noon, her voice dripped with fake sweetness as she called out, "Dear nephew, your fourth aunt has come to check on you. My heart has ached for you all these years." However, her grand entrance ground to a sudden halt the moment her eyes fell upon the elegant young woman organizing the interior. "And just who exactly are you?" she demanded, her tone instantly shifting to one of deep suspicion. The loud, theatrical wailing of my fourth aunt, Su Fengying, completely shattered my peaceful slumber. She was putting on quite a performance outside, loudly lamenting how she had dreamed of my late father and weeping over how deeply she supposedly cared for my well-being. Recognizing her grating voice instantly, a wave of profound irritation washed over me. My late father had been burdened with 6 siblings, the vast majority of whom were utterly despicable human beings, while my second uncle had aggressively swindled us out of our entire inheritance. This particular aunt specialized in subtly draining whatever little resources I had left. To make matters worse, My fifth and sixth uncles had actively aided the second uncle during the betrayal that cost my father his life. Out of the entire treacherous clan, only my third uncle's family possessed a shred of genuine decency. Letting out a massive yawn, I stepped outside and bluntly informed her that her loud dramatic display was giving me a severe migraine. She nearly snapped at my blatant disrespect, but the moment her greedy eyes caught sight of the massive stack of fresh rabbit pelts, she forced her rage down. Quick as a flash, she slipped right back into her persona of a deeply compassionate, protective matriarch. She began lecturing me on how incredibly brutal the current economic climate was, patronizingly advising me that I desperately needed to learn how to manage my assets. I merely offered a smug smile and offered a casual, non-committal agreement to her words. My calm, unbothered demeanor completely threw her off balance. The naive, easily manipulated boy she used to exploit would have broken down in tears of gratitude and blindly handed over his entire haul without a second thought. Getting straight to her actual, greedy objective, she eagerly volunteered to transport the meat to the market and safeguard the profits on my behalf. Shifting the burden, I casually replied that she would have to clear any financial transactions with my spouse first. Standing down by the creek, the captive woman visibly bristled with annoyance upon hearing me refer to her as my wife. She was clearly convinced I was merely using the title to social advantage, yet she chose to remain completely silent. Visibly panicked, my aunt aggressively yanked me by the sleeve out of earshot, fiercely whispering that I must never allow a newly acquired woman to govern my finances. She adamantly argued that a proper household required the man to maintain absolute and total authority over all household wealth. I calmly countered her logic, stating that a true partnership required mutual respect, and firmly declared that my partner would retain absolute final veto power. Seizing the offensive, I then politely requested she return the cumulative 30 copper coins she had supposedly been saving for me over the past few years. Her facial muscles twitched in pure panic at the unexpected demand. The ugly reality was that she had never set aside a single coin, having instantly spent every stolen bit of my resource on her own immediate family. She began to nervously stutter, inventing a flimsy excuse about needing to consult her husband before any funds could be released. Realizing she couldn't manipulate me, she pivoted her strategy and approached the young woman, putting on a fake display of maternal warmth to win her over. However, my companion treated her as if she were completely invisible, remaining entirely unbothered and icily focused on her skinning duties. My aunt's eyes lingered hungrily on the rows of salted meat and pelts hanging against the outer wall, practically salivating at the thought of hauling it all to her own cellar. Breaking her silence, the young woman coldly pointed out that our own household was on the brink of starvation. She sharply noted that I had literally gambled with my life against wild predators in the mountains to secure this food, meaning there was absolutely zero logical reason to surrender it to an outsider. This blunt defiance completely shattered my aunt's fragile composure. Screaming in a fit of pure rage, she swung her hand and delivered a sharp slap across the woman's face, shrieking that a purchased servant possessed absolutely zero authority to speak to her betters. I violently lunged forward to intervene, but before I could even cover the distance, the captive woman delivered a blistering counterslap of her own. Her expression remained entirely calm and completely unbothered as her palm connected with my aunt's cheek. The older woman stood frozen in absolute, paralyzed shock, as no one in the history of the entire village had ever possessed the audacity to strike her. Infuriated, my aunt raised her palm to strike a second time, but I violently intercepted her wrist mid-air from behind. "Lay another hand on my wife and see exactly what happens to you," I growled, pinning her arm in place. She gaped at me in sheer disbelief, sputtering hysterically that she was my own flesh and blood and demanding to know how I could side with an outsider over family. I stared back at her with absolute authority, declaring firmly that this woman was now my spouse, and from this moment onward, she held absolute control over my household. Hearing this, the young captive froze entirely, a subtle hint of vulnerability finally softening her otherwise frosty gaze. It was glaringly obvious that throughout her entire turbulent life, No one had ever stepped forward to shield her in such a manner. My aunt erupted into frantic shrieks, labeling me an ungrateful monster and falsely claiming she had nurtured me like her own offspring for a decade. But the performance was hollow. We both understood the wretched reality of her actions. Finally losing all patience with her hollow theatrics, I snapped and demanded she cease her pathetic lies. I bluntly reminded her that aside from my honorable third uncle, every single relative had actively betrayed my father the moment his corpse grew cold. I explicitly barred her from ever crossing my property line again, demanding the immediate reimbursement of the 30 copper coins she had systematically pilfered from me. Trembling with a toxic mixture of malice and humiliation, she stormed down the ridge, screaming back over her shoulder that she would unleash my powerful second uncle to break me. I merely spat into the dirt, entirely unfazed by her desperate threats. Once her screeching faded into the distance, I knelt down beside the young woman, immediately noticing 5 dark crimson welts bruising her fair cheek. I softly inquired if the impact had caused her severe pain, but true to her disciplined nature, she maintained a stubborn, prideful silence. Reaching out, I gently placed the back of my hand against her forehead, causing her to instantly stiffen in surprise. It was clear that no man outside of her paternal bloodline had ever occupied such close physical proximity to her. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" she demanded icily, her eyes narrowing in deep suspicion. I calmly informed her that her skin was radiating a dangerous fever, instructing her to open her mouth so I could properly inspect her respiratory tract. Though she instinctively resisted the command, I adopted a stern, authoritative tone that ultimately compelled her to reluctantly comply. I must confess, being mere inches away from such a breathtaking countenance caused my focus to briefly falter. She instantly caught me swallowing nervously, her gaze sharpening with immediate mistrust at my apparent distraction. Quickly recovering my composure, I clinically noted that her tonsils were severely inflamed and strictly advised her to minimize her speaking to preserve her strength. What followed was a highly uncomfortable, accidental blunder. As I began to withdraw my fingers from her mouth, she abruptly clamped her jaw shut, resulting in an inadvertent, highly suggestive popping sound breaking the quiet air. She was absolutely incandescent with rage, fully convinced I had engineered the awkward mishap purely to degrade her. Shooting me a look of profound disgust, she swiftly pivoted on her heel and marched away to resume hanging the fresh pelts against the timber framing. A wave of intense embarrassment washed over me, though it was genuinely nothing more than a case of atrocious timing. I trailed behind her, gently pressing for information regarding how many months she had been suffering from this persistent respiratory ailment. She muttered a brief, evasive answer, making it abundantly clear that she desired absolutely zero further dialogue with me. Shifting gears, I marched out to a nearby patch of earth to harvest some wild ginger roots. The primitive inhabitants of this era were completely oblivious to the plant's immense culinary and medicinal properties. Gathering a handful of therapeutic herbs from the creek bank as well, I returned to the earthen stove, heated the iron pan, and dumped a generous portion of cooking fat inside to sauté the ginger alongside fresh rabbit meat. The young woman observed the entire process from the doorway, her features contorted in absolute horror at my cooking methods. To her, my liberal use of the rare cooking oil was a display of astronomical extravagance. In this impoverished community, a typical family would merely scrape a microscopic dollop of animal fat into a massive pot of boiling water and label the bland fluid a soup. But coming from a modern era of abundance, I poured the oil without a second thought, completely ignoring the strict rationing of the times. She silently condemned my actions, reasoning to herself that my extreme poverty was a direct consequence of my utterly incompetent financial management. Disregarding her judgment, I finished simmering a thick, fragrant rabbit stew, tossed in a few crisp greens from the garden plot, and set the steaming vessel onto our battered wooden table. I instructed her to sit and nourish herself while I stepped outside to manage a few pressing chores. Instead of thanking me, she scowled deeply and began fiercely berating me for mindlessly squandering 2 full pounds of prime venison and a small fortune in cooking fat on a single meal. She aggressively calculated the local market values aloud, pointing out that the ingredients inside that single pot could have easily been bartered to secure an entire pound of life-saving rice grain. She possessed an incredible, innate talent for fiscal management. I let out a light-hearted chuckle and urged her to put her anxieties to rest, reassuring her that 2 pounds of small game was a drop in the bucket. I confidently promised her that from this moment onward, fresh meat and fish would become staple items at our dinner table every single day. My strategy was to head back into the foothills for another tracking session this afternoon, process the haul tonight, and barter the goods for substantial grain supplies tomorrow morning. I emphasized that as long as we operated as a unified team, our standard of living would rapidly improve. She elegantly took her seat at the battered table, keeping her spine perfectly straight in a posture that unmistakably betrayed her aristocratic upbringing. Her eyebrows shot up in curiosity as she observed me tossing a handful of wild, grassy flora into a pot of rolling, boiling water. "What exactly is the purpose of that?" she questioned, tracking my movements. I reassured her that her respiratory ailment wasn't fatal, explaining that she was merely suffering from tonsillitis, which caused the painful inflammation in her throat. The medical terminology meant absolutely nothing to her primitive understanding, but I lacked the vocabulary to break down modern pathology into concepts she would readily grasp. Slide a steaming bowl of the savory rabbit broth directly in front of her. I gestured for her to begin. Pressing her delicate lips to the rim, she took an initial, cautious sip, and her subtle facial expression made it immediately obvious that the flavor blew her away. The rich gaminess of the fresh venison fused flawlessly with the sharp, aromatic notes of the crushed ginger, creating a deeply satisfying profile. Overwhelmed by the delicious taste, she abandoned her hesitation and took a massive, greedy gulp from the vessel. Intrigued, she demanded to know what magical ingredient gave the dish such a uniquely appetizing depth. I revealed that the secret was wild ginger, explaining how its natural properties effectively neutralize the pungent odors of wild game while infusing the meat with a rich fragrance. When I playfully pressed her to admit if she found the meal delicious, she merely delivered a frosty, reserved reply, labeling it as tolerable. I knew that was simply her prideful way of conceding that she thoroughly enjoyed the food. A serene, unexpected wave of tranquility filled the cramped hovel as we dined together in comfortable silence. Once the meal concluded, she gathered the soiled utensils and marched down to the running creek to rinse them clean. Feeling incredibly grime-ridden and exhausted from a full night of traversing muddy mountain trails, I decided to plunge directly into the cool stream to cleanse myself. I had to admit, the physical vessel I now inhabited was remarkably well-built, possessing dense muscle fibers and a highly athletic physique. As I casually strolled past her workstation completely shirtless, I caught her stealing a quick, lingering glance at my exposed torso. She rapidly snapped her gaze back to the dishes, but not before a delicate, telltale crimson flush spread across her cheeks, causing me to smile triumphantly. I broke the silence by inquiring if the raw soreness in her respiratory tract had begun to dissipate. She paused, inwardly assessing her body, and was visibly startled to realize that the sharp agony had significantly numbed thanks to the warm herbal infusion I had prepared. Eager to unlock the secret, she demanded to know the identity of the medicinal foliage I had harvested. Sensing an opportunity, I offered a playful bargain, proposing to trade the secret name of the vegetation in exchange for her own identity. After a long moment of internal calculation, she finally relented, quietly uttering the name, Wang Shijiao. I rolled the syllables over my tongue in a soft whisper, privately noting that it was an incredibly beautiful, elegant name. Fulfilling my end of the deal, I informed her that the therapeutic plant was locally known as fish mint. Her utter lack of recognition didn't surprise me in the slightest, as this era was profoundly uneducated regarding the abundant natural resources surrounding them. Hoisting a woven foraging basket onto my shoulder, I pivoted back toward the towering mountain peaks, my mind buzzing with an intense, calculated drive. To guarantee our survival, amass absolute influence, and eventually exact bloody vengeance on the relatives who orchestrated my father's execution, I needed capital. Systematic, High-volume hunting was merely the foundational stepping stone toward erecting my future empire. While I was deep in the timberland, an unexpected visitor arrived at the cabin to confront Wang Shijiao, a tiny, frantic girl roughly 5 or 6 years of age, sporting dual braided pigtails and luminous eyes that resembled polished black obsidian, came sprinting onto the property. Dissolving into floods of tears, the frantic child confessed her absolute terror that Wang Shijiao had somehow done me harm. Wang Shijiao swiftly intervened to soothe the child's hysteria, calmly reassuring her that I was perfectly safe and merely out tracking wild game. This sweet little girl was none other than Xian, the precious young daughter of my honorable third uncle. Out of my entire extended bloodline, my third uncle was the sole individual who harbored genuine affection and loyalty toward me. When my father was brutally assassinated by the notorious outlaw commander Himatsu, my treacherous second uncle actively lobbied to surrender my helpless body to the marauders. However, my courageous third uncle stood as my lone shield, going so far as to sever his own arm right before Himatsu's eyes to guarantee my survival. Had he not made that horrific sacrifice, my life would have ended right then and there. Little Xian made a habit of visiting my plot nearly every single day, possessing an immense adoration for her older cousin. The moment she met Wang Shijiao, she enthusiastically addressed her as sister-in-law, innocently pressing her on when a new baby would be arriving. Though the sudden question left Wang Shijiao deeply flustered, she found herself instinctively charmed by the child's bright, radiant energy. The two quickly bonded, and Xian eagerly spent the afternoon sharing extensive stories regarding my past and character. Meanwhile, down in the main settlement, my fourth aunt, Su Fengying, was absolutely consumed by an explosive, toxic rage. She was entirely unable to accept that the boy she had spent years exploiting had suddenly spoken to her with such scathing, icy authority. Glancing at the pitifully sparse animal pelts adorning her own walls, she burned with a fierce envy, fully convinced that the massive bounty at my cabin rightfully belonged in her possession. Her resentment reached a boiling point as she paced her floor, mourning the lost wealth of those 20 rabbit skins. Her husband, Shui Wanfu, eventually stumbled through the door looking completely broken and defeated after a grueling night in the wilderness. His agonizing efforts had yielded nothing more than a handful of bitter wild greens, a single mangy hair, and a pair of shins covered in bloody, thorn-ripped lacerations. The moment she informed him that I had effortlessly secured over a score of pristine hairs in a single outing, his eyes practically bulged out of their sockets in sheer shock. He found it utterly impossible to comprehend how the established laughingstock of the community could achieve such an impossible tracking feat. Driven by pure greed, the despicable couple immediately marched up the ridge to my property, their eyes boring into the fresh pelts drying on the line with naked hostility. Shui Wanfu was practically salivating on the spot, his mind rapidly formulating a plan to sneakily plunder my hard-earned assets. However, before he could take a single step toward the rack, a booming, authoritative voice materialized directly from the shadows behind them. It was my formidable third uncle, Shui Gang, a hulking, one-armed powerhouse widely recognized as the most lethal warrior in the entire region. This was the very man who had fearlessly mutilated his own body years ago, lopping off his limb in front of the warlord Himatsu to preserve my breath. Catching the thieves red-handed, he delivered a blistering, razor-sharp reprimand, ordering them to vacate the perimeter immediately and warning them never to slink around my household again. The cowardly pair sprinted away like exposed bandits. Despite his physical limitation, my third uncle possessed a strike far more devastating than most men utilizing 2 limbs. The entire treacherous sibling clan harbored an absolute, paralyzing terror of his wrath. Having successfully secured the perimeter, the veteran warrior formally introduced himself to Wang Shijiao, spending a significant portion of the day educating her on my true family history. Later that afternoon, I slipped back into the dense, towering mountain ranges to resume my high-yield harvesting operation. Trailing along the upper paths, I observed starving townspeople desperately stripping and chewing on raw tree bark while violently cursing the oppressive local authorities. The ambient desperation was so severe that whispers of abandoning the village to join Humatsu's outlaw syndicate were openly circulating among the youths. Keeping my revolutionary mechanical bow entirely masked from view, I navigated straight to the perilous, unmapped edges of the deep peaks where no human eye could track my methods. I tracked and ambushed game relentlessly until the final shroud of night consumed the valley, ultimately securing a massive haul of nearly 30 hares. My woven container was packed so densely with fresh game that the structural straps groaned under the immense weight as I hauled it back down. Upon stepping across my threshold, I found Wang Shijiao wide awake and anxiously awaiting my return. Though she had diligently remained inside the subterranean root cellar as instructed, the heavy disclosures from my third uncle had completely robbed her of sleep. Throughout the long afternoon, Shui Gang had painted a vivid picture of my reality. How my heroic father was foully assassinated, how my own flesh and blood had systematically stripped me of dignity, and how, despite the crushing cruelty of this world, I had remained a man of pure integrity who refused to lie or manipulate others. The tragic narrative had clearly struck a deep, sympathetic chord within her highly guarded heart. Furthermore, looking at the treacherous dark peaks outside, a genuine anxiety had gripped her that I might have been torn apart by the apex predators ruling the high timberland. The moment she detected my footsteps outside, she immediately emerged from the subterranean root cellar. I was anxious that some of the locals might come looking for trouble in your absence. I am relieved to see you returned unharmed, she murmured, catching me completely off guard with her candor. Voluntarily stepping forward, she relieved me of the heavy foraging container without waiting to be asked. She then informed me that my third uncle had paid a visit and coordinated a business opportunity on my behalf. He advised that I transport the processed pelts directly to a wealthy merchant known as Lord Song the following morning, promising a far more lucrative return on my labor. Hearing mention of my third uncle caused a flood of profound, affectionate memories to wash through my mind. Specifically, the traumatic yet heroic image of him severing his own limb and dropping to his knees before Humatsu to secure my breath. Turning to Wang Shijiao, I instructed her to set apart 3 of our finest catches to present to my third uncle's household as a gesture of gratitude. I reasoned aloud that once the community recognized Wang Shijiao as part of our family unit, his formidable reputation would shield her within the settlement whenever I traveled. Wang Shijiao instantly corrected my phrasing with a sharp, defensive edge, stating firmly, "I am not your spouse." Deflecting the tension, she revealed that she had replicated the rabbit broth using my exact culinary method from earlier, before heading outside to begin dressing the new hall. Her icy exterior didn't bother me in the slightest. In fact, her fierce independence and stubborn pride only made our dynamic far more compelling. Surveying the property, I noted that the entire hovel was immaculate, the existing hides were perfectly cured, and she had even thoroughly cultivated the soil in our small garden plot. Sampling her rendition of the stew, my eyes widened in genuine delight as I realized she had actually elevated the recipe's flavor profile. This extraordinary woman had cost me a mere handful of grain, and my admiration for her was expanding exponentially by the hour. We operated as a synchronized team deep into the midnight hours, processing the fresh game. To grant her proper privacy and ensure her comfort, I chose to lay my bedding outside under the open sky. The moment the first light of dawn broke, I packed the massive bundle of cured skins and fresh venison and sprinted toward the main settlement. My third uncle was currently employed as an elite security officer at the sprawling estate of Lord Song, a prominent tycoon whose massive compound featured grand scarlet gates and over 30 luxurious chambers. Despite possessing only a single arm, Shui Gang remained one of the most formidable martial artists in the entire province. His dangerous skill set commanded a premium salary of 10 full pounds of rice grain per month at the estate. He greeted me warmly at the rear service entrance, offering a firm, encouraging pat on my shoulder before revealing he had negotiated an exclusive transaction with a man named Manager Wu. The baseline agreement was set at 2 copper pieces per premium hide and 3 copper pieces for every pound of fresh meat. He further disclosed that the Song household intended to recruit new estate staff the following month, promising to utilize his personal leverage to secure me a position. He emphasized that gaining employment under Lord Song's banner operated as an absolute shield of immunity, asserting that even the warlord Humatsi would never dare harass an employee of such a powerful house. The transaction proceeded flawlessly without a single complication. I successfully traded 24 pristine pelts for 68 copper pieces, alongside 30 pounds of prime meat for an additional 90 copper pieces, bringing my grand total to a staggering 158 coins. This was an absolute fortune that the previous owner of this body could never have dreamed of holding. However, just as I prepared to exit the courtyard, the avaricious figure of Manager Wu deliberately obstructed my path. He was an incredibly predatory man with a dense mustache who looked down his nose at everyone with a permanent, squinting sneer. He was clearly demanding an illicit commission for facilitating the trade. Catching my uncle's subtle nod to play along with the corruption, I politely extended 10 copper coins, humbly apologizing for my apparent ignorance of the estate's unwritten policies. Instead of accepting the bribe, Manager Wu aggressively hurled the copper pieces directly back into my face. He branded me a worthless peasant, loudly sneering that 10 measly coins weren't even enough to cover the cost of his morning tea. My third uncle immediately stepped in, swallowing his pride to offer desperate flattery and placate the corrupt supervisor. Manager Wu finally demanded his actual extortion price, a staggering 120 coins to guarantee me a servant position within the estate. He arrogantly noted that once I was under the protection of the Song family banner, the bandit commander Humatsi would never dare lay a finger on me. To add to the humiliation, he casually referred to me as a dog before turning his back. A toxic wave of absolute fury boiled in my chest. This tyrant was not only systematically robbing my hard-earned profits but openly degrading my humanity to my face. My uncle desperately tried to negotiate a lower bribe, pleading that I had just taken a wife and required every scrap of capital simply to survive the winter. Manager Wu merely delivered a parting sneer, remarking that a pathetic loser of my stature was miraculously lucky to have ever found a woman willing to marry me. The moment we cleared the estate gates and hit the open street, my self-control completely shattered, and I unleashed a torrent of fierce curses against him. I branded him a parasitic, dog-like tyrant, silently swearing an absolute oath that I would violently settle the score with him in the near future. My third uncle stared down at me in absolute bewilderment, as if he were looking at a complete stranger rather than the timid nephew he used to know. Exhaling a sharp, ragged breath, I forcefully reined in my temper and calmed my racing pulse. I anxiously inquired whether my blunt refusal to pay the extortion fee would result in severe professional repercussions or danger for him. My third uncle quickly offered reassurance, explaining that while Manager Wu could subject him to verbal abuse, he lacked the authority to terminate his employment since Lord Song had personally hired him. Even so, the sheer, unchecked avarice of the estate supervisor weighed heavily on the veteran warrior's spirit. His broad shoulders slumped as he fell completely silent, dropping into a heavy squat against the brick wall. It was glaringly obvious that a profound, terrifying anxiety was eating away at his composure. He finally confessed that in a matter of mere days, Humatsi, the ruthless warlord ruling the peaks, would descend to extract his monthly extortion tribute from the settlement. Every single inhabitant residing across the Green Bull Mountain territory was forced to pay this blood tax or face immediate, merciless execution. The corrupt local authorities completely ignored the crisis, refusing to ever intervene on behalf of the terrorized peasants. But the most catastrophic detail was yet to come. My uncle had intercepted dark rumors circulating through the market that Humatsi was suffering from vivid, paranoid nightmares of my late father returning from the grave to claim vengeance. To permanently soothe his paranoia, the Bandit King had resolved to preemptively slaughter me just to eliminate any potential threat to his rule. That agonizing realization was the true catalyst behind my uncle's frantic desperation to secure me sanctuary within the walls of the Song compound. Locking a pair of deeply pained, sorrowful eyes onto mine, he urgently implored me to gather my earnings, seize the young woman, and flee the territory immediately. He begged me to abandon the Green Bull Mountain region entirely and never look back. I could visibly perceive the immense emotional agony it caused him to urge my exile, given that he had consistently shielded and nurtured me like his own flesh and blood. However, I firmly shook my head and rejected the notion of running away. I possessed a revolutionary strategic advantage. If Humatsu's syndicate pushed me to the absolute brink, I had my lethal repeating crossbow hidden away. I was fully prepared to wage a one-man war against his entire faction if survival demanded it, though I recognized that bloodshed remained a final, desperate resort. Instead, I shifted the conversation and inquired about alternative mercantile outlets operating within the settlement. The unfair pricing dictated by Manager Wu's monopoly was simply too low to sustain my long-term financial goals. My uncle reluctantly mentioned a newly established trade shop managed by an independent entrepreneur named Wang Chaosing. However, he quickly issued a stern warning, noting that the entrenched, powerful local syndicates were violently sabotaging and bullying the outsider to drive him out of business. He strongly advised me to steer completely clear of the conflict zone. Suddenly, Manager Wu's grating voice bellowed from the interior courtyard, summoning my uncle back to his post. The veteran warrior offered a brief, hurried nod and scrambled back through the rear entrance to comply with the command. Watching his retreating figure, this once magnificent, proud martial hero now forced to run like a submissive servant at a corrupt bureaucrat's whim. A profound, crushing sorrow gripped my heart. He had systematically sacrificed his physical body, his social standing, and his personal pride solely to preserve what remained of his family. His exhausted posture painfully mirrored the broken, middle-aged working-class men from my modern past life, individuals who routinely swallowed systematic humiliation every single day just to keep food on their children's plates. I successfully located the trading establishment managed by the independent entrepreneur, Wang Chaosing. He immediately evaluated my goods and offered a baseline of 3 copper pieces per premium hide, a significantly more lucrative rate than Manager Wu's exploitative pricing. Seizing the opportunity, I initiated a strategic conversation with him regarding a potential partnership aimed at systematically dismantling Lord Song's absolute monopoly over the regional marketplace. Although he dismissed my grand vision as absolute madness and refused to take me seriously, I knew I had successfully planted a powerful seed of rebellion in his mind. Following the transaction, I shifted my focus to securing essential provisions for my household. I allocated 50 copper pieces to purchase 10 pounds of raw rice grain, alongside a few pieces of crispy fried dough for a mere fraction of a coin. I strictly refused to authorize any further expenditures, completely committed to hoarding every single coin for our future security. Navigating the long dirt path back to the ridge, my mind actively formulated a sustainable, long-term commercial blueprint. Systematic small-game hunting was a finite resource. The ongoing, severe drought had already pushed the mountain wildlife population to the absolute brink of extinction. I analytically reviewed which industrial sectors were currently dominating the urban markets. While grain distribution reigned supreme during this environmental crisis, the entrenched local merchant network maintained an ironclad, unbreakable monopoly over the supply chain. However, I identified a massive technological void in this reality. The concept of vegetable-based cooking oil was entirely undiscovered, forcing the populace to rely exclusively on rendered animal fat. This realization ignited a brilliant business concept in my mind. The surrounding mountain slopes were heavily populated with wild tea trees, meaning their abundant seeds could be mechanically pressed into premium cooking oil utilizing traditional processing methodologies I mastered in my modern life. If I could successfully pioneer the mass production of organic plant oil, it would serve as my definitive gateway to astronomical wealth. But before launching an industrial empire, I had to prioritize immediate survival and systematically accumulate a foundational cash reserve. Arriving back at my property exactly at noon, I called out across the threshold to announce my return. Instantly, a heavy wave of dread caused my stomach to bottom out. Seated arrogantly at my battered wooden table was my treacherous second uncle, Shui Zhongyun, the very monster who had orchestrated my father's downfall and attempted to surrender me to the bandits. Stationed directly beside him like a obedient, rabid hound was his loyal henchman, Lu Jigal. Wang Shijiao was positioned directly across from the intruders, remaining perfectly motionless and enveloped in a wall of absolute silence. The atmosphere inside the cramped hovel was suffocatingly tense. My second uncle sat with an posture of absolute authority, projecting an aura as though he were the rightful proprietor of my home. Luji Gal loomed directly over his shoulder, mimicking a faithful guard dog. Across the table, Wang Shijiao maintained her icy, unbothered composure despite the immense psychological pressure of the confrontation. My second uncle addressed me using his characteristic, domineering tone. The exact same condescending voice he utilized to subjugate the entire village ever since he stole my father's executive position. He demandingly signaled for me to step forward, barking that he had a critical directive to deliver to me. I completely disregarded his presence at first, treating him as if he were entirely invisible. I deliberately marched past him to Wang Shijiao's side, gently presenting her with the 2 fresh oil cakes I had purchased in the urban market. I softly informed her that my third uncle's leverage had successfully secured us an excellent return on our inventory, encouraging her to nourish herself without worry. Incensed by my blatant disrespect toward the community leader, Luji Gal erupted in anger and began aggressively shouting at me. I shut down his outburst instantly with a razor-sharp verbal counterstrike. I icily reminded him that a low-born servant possessed absolutely zero right to interject in the private affairs of my family bloodline, explicitly branding him a malicious, barking dog. With a single, freezing glance, my second uncle instantly silenced his minion before cutting straight to his actual objective. He warned that Humatsu's heavily armed raiders were scheduled to descend upon the settlement in a mere 3 days to violently extract outstanding debts, emphasizing that my survival was highly unlikely. He then demandingly ordered me to immediately surrender custody of Wang Shijiao to his household. He falsely claimed that relocating her to his estate was the only viable method to guarantee her personal safety during the upcoming raid. I saw straight through his transparent manipulation. He was fully aware that Humatsu's syndicate intended to execute me to soothe the warlord's paranoia, and he possessed absolutely zero intention of offering me sanctuary. His true, predatory motive was to simply exploit my impending demise to violently claim Wang Shijiao as a personal concubine. The man was completely bankrupt of any recognizable moral compass. I offered a cold, mocking smirk and firmly stated that my domestic arrangements were entirely none of his business. I punctuated the statement by declaring that Wang Shijiao would remain strictly under my roof. The unexpected defiance left him completely paralyzed with astonishment. The broken, submissive boy he had tormented for years would have naturally obeyed his dictates without a single shred of resistance. His features twisted into a dark scowl as he demanded to know if I was intentionally choosing to defy his absolute authority as chief. He viciously struck a psychological nerve, falsely accusing me of causing my own father's execution and claiming I was now actively dragging an innocent young woman down to the grave alongside me. Wang Shijiao abruptly intervened, her voice carrying a sharp, definitive edge as she stated, "I will not go." Without offering him a single parting glance, she turned on her heel and walked away, refusing to grant him even an ounce of unearned deference. A sudden, dangerous flash of homicidal fury flickered across his features at her blatant rejection. I stepped in, coolly informing him that since my partner was fully prepared to weather any impending hardships by my side, his superficial concern was entirely unnecessary. His jaw tightened as he issued a dark ultimatum, warning me that when Humatsu's raiders inevitably descended upon the ridge, he would refuse to negotiate on my behalf. I delivered a blistering verbal counterstrike, reminding him that my continued breathing was a direct consequence of my third uncle's sacrifice, not his empty promises. I added pointedly that he had never once raised a finger to protect me from harm throughout my entire miserable existence. Then, I drove a psychological dagger deep into his pride, stating that acting as a submissive lapdog for a warlord like Humatsu would only lead to a dead end. I fiercely reminded him that my late father had chosen to rebel against the syndicate for that exact reason. Incensed by my audacity, Luji Gal lunged forward with his palm raised to deliver a vicious strike across my face. Anticipating the clumsy movement, I drove my heel into his midsection, sending him crashing violently into the dirt before smashing a heavy wooden bench directly over his torso. A sharp shriek of agony ripped from his lungs as the timber splintered against his ribs. My second uncle's knuckles turned white as he clenched his fists, his entire posture radiating an immediate readiness to personally execute me on the spot. However, right before the confrontation could turn lethal, a bright, melodic voice echoed across the clearing from the path below. It was my third aunt, Wang Tsuerong, accompanied by little Xian, whose braided pigtails bounced energetically as she sprinted toward our perimeter. The dense, toxic cloud of rage enveloping my mind instantly evaporated the moment my eyes landed on the child's radiant face. I scooped her up into a warm embrace, turning to offer a deeply respectful and genuine greeting to my matriarchal relative. My third aunt was a formidable, robust woman hailing from the legendary Shao village, an insular community where every single resident mastered practical hand-to-hand combat from infancy. Her raw physical power was so immense that not a single able-bodied man within our own settlement possessed the courage to challenge her in a brawl. Recognizing the severe tactical disadvantage, my second uncle slowly relaxed his fighting posture, his expression souring into a defeated scowl. Abandoning his aggressive stance, he signaled a retreat, bitterly muttering that we should rot in our own domestic problems before marching down the ridge. Luji Gal trailed miserably behind his master, limping heavily and casting a venomous, homicidal glare back over his shoulder toward me. Yet, the moment his eyes accidentally locked with my third aunt's steady, unblinking stare, he rapidly averted his face in sheer terror. He vividly remembered an incident years prior when she had delivered a single, thunderous open-handed slap that completely dislocated his jawbone. Watching their pathetic retreat, my aunt spat aggressively into the dirt, her features contorted in absolute disgust. "Your heroic father treated that snake with nothing but pure generosity," she remarked with immense bitterness, labeling him a backstabbing parasite far worse than a feral stray. True to her protective nature, Wang Tsuerong launched into a fierce, affectionate lecture the absolute second she stepped across my threshold. She fiercely demanded to know why I hadn't dispatched a messenger the moment that treacherous chief dared to trespass on my plot. Her aggressive fussing and genuine, unprompted concern felt exactly like the protective embrace of a true maternal figure. The familiar warmth unexpectedly triggered memories of my biological parents from my modern past life, reminding me of how profoundly isolated I had felt in that concrete world. A deep, long-forgotten emotional comfort expanded within my chest, anchoring me to this harsh reality in a way I hadn't anticipated. What truly astonished me during this exchange, however, was the dramatic shift in Wang Shijiao's behavioral pattern. Ever since I had legally purchased her freedom from the auction block, she had maintained a completely frozen, unapproachable distance from every human being she encountered. Yet, to my utter disbelief, she was actively engaging in a calm, civil, and remarkably respectful dialogue with my formidable aunt. Furthermore, when little Xian eagerly bounded over to her side, sweetly volunteering her tiny hands to help rinse and dress the damp rabbit pelts, a genuine, soft warmth illuminated Wang Shijiao's features as she gently agreed to the help. A profound, internal transformation was clearly taking root within her highly guarded psyche, even if I couldn't entirely decipher the psychological catalyst behind it. The pleasant atmosphere evaporated the moment my aunt's expression shifted into an intense, dead serious gravity. Echoing the exact, desperate counsel of her husband, she urgently insisted that my only logical recourse was to abandon the property and flee the territory under the cover of night. I looked her dead in the eye and quietly posed a devastating counterquestion. If I choose the coward's path and vanish into the night, what catastrophic vengeance will Humatsi's raiders unleash upon your household in my stead?